Hi, my name is Cliff Bray. This is my 2000 Jeep Wrangler. I was driving it the other day and the temperature gauge started to kind of creep up a little bit there. I pulled over and had a leak in the radiator. So I'm going to replace the old radiator today with a new one and solve that problem. Okay, getting ready to get started now. Got the hood up there on the car. One thing that I'll just say, just as a warning here, as it seems like people get hurt every year doing this, make sure that the car is completely cooled down before you begin this project. A lot of people every year, when they're opening those radiator caps, wind up getting burned. Sometimes they try to just, turn it just half a turn and they let it hiss for a while and let the pressure off, and then they open it the rest of the way. But on any given day, when you're opening that thing, it's very possible it'll just come flying off and spraying hot steam and water all over your face and hands and burn you pretty bad. It happens to people every year, so just make sure the car is completely cooled down before you begin this project. So what we'll do now is we'll take a look at the tools that we'll be using. Okay, here are the tools I'll be using here as we get started. There's a kind of a long, flat screwdriver, some wire cutters, razor knife, channel locks, ratchet and sockets, flashlight, and there's the new radiator hoses I'm going to be putting on. I'm also going to put a new radiator cap in, and then the clamps for those hoses. You'll need some paper towels and a regular cloth towel that you don't mind throwing away because it will get kind of messy here. And this here is just something to hold the bolts. I always recommend using these magnetic trays. You throw a bolt in there and it won't come out. Just like any other project, this one here is full of some Jesus bolts that seem to just disappear into thin air if you don't watch what you're doing. So I always just throw them in a magnetic tray like that, and that way I don't wind up losing them. So not a whole lot of tools required for this job. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, here's the new radiator that's going to be going into the Jeep. Let's just take a look at a couple of things here real quick, just to kind of get oriented. Of course, you got the radiator cap right there. You got one inlet right there with a hose, of course. Another inlet right up here with a hose, so we'll have to be removing those hoses. But down here, a lot of people don't know this, you've got two other inlets, one there, one right over there, and those go to your transmission to cool down the hydraulic fluid. And we'll talk some more about those in a minute because they can be tricky. And then if you come over here to the side, you're going to see three bolt holes right along the side there, on both sides. Come over here. Take a look at them over here. There's one, two, there's a third one down there. Those three bolt holes on both sides, or the 6 bolts, are going to hold the radiator in. You're also going to have to take 4 other bolts off that hold the fan cover on. So we'll come over to the car here right now, and we'll just take a look here real quick. Right here where it says caution fan, this plastic, there's 2 bolts on each side that hold that on. We'll be taking those off. And of course, we'll be taking the hoses off. We're also going to be removing the overflow container, that kind of vanilla looking thing right there. So those will all be coming off as well. So let's get started. Over to the car. One of the first things you can do is remove the top radiator hose. You don't want to remove the bottom radiator hose until you've drained the radiator. Some of the hoses will be held on with a clamp, which is a screw type clamp like this one. Other ones will have that pincher type clamp. But just go ahead and loosen those. If you have trouble getting the hose off, you can take a screwdriver and just kind of pry around the edges there, and it'll just pop right off. If you do that with a screwdriver and you want to save the hose, just be very careful you don't tear it. But I recommend replacing the radiator hoses with new ones. That's what I'm going to do, simply because you're going to all the trouble of taking them off, and they only cost about 12 bucks. So just put a new radiator hose while you're going through all the trouble there. The next thing you can do up top here before you climb underneath the car is to pull off the overflow container. It's held in place with these little brackets there that just slide down into those slots. But to get it to come off, there's a little button right down there. You see where that little circle is? You just put a screwdriver, your finger in there or whatever, and press in, and then the container will just pop straight up. And so we'll go ahead and pull the hose off there and the container off, and then we'll come back and we'll take a look at the fan cover. Okay, so now we'll come over here, we'll take a look at that fan cover. Again, there's the fan cover. It says caution fan, but you can see now I've taken those 4 bolts off, and I've moved the fan cover back away from the radiator. See that? About a 3 to 4 inch gap there now, and there's the fan. And now what that will allow is when I loosen those 3 bolts on both sides of the radiator, I'll be able just to lift the radiator out. Otherwise, if I left that fan cover bolted into the radiator, it would get caught up on the fan. I wouldn't be able to lift the radiator straight out. So with that done, that's kind of the top part, so to speak, of this radiator removal here. And now we'll go underneath the car for a while. Okay, we're underneath the car now. I'm looking at the bottom of the radiator, the right side of the radiator, as I'm laying on my back here looking up at it. And on the far right side there's a valve. You see it right there? And it's dripping a little bit of radiator fluid right now because I already opened it up and drained the fluid out of the radiator. And you just turn that counterclockwise and it'll start running out. Just be careful when it does start running out. It runs out pretty fast. But that's how you drain the radiator from underneath the car. And of course you have to have some kind of a catch basin. I just used a regular plastic tub to catch the radiator fluid. I just threw that away. Some people save it, but I'm going to replace the fluid with brand new fluid. While we're under here, there's one of those lines that's going to go to the transmission. And like I said earlier, getting those off sometimes is a little tricky. Over here, there's the other one, and then there's the lower radiator hose right there. We'll be taking that off, but again, you don't want to take that off until you've drained the radiator. Otherwise, as you pull it off, it'll cause a pretty big mess down here. So radiator fluid is now drained, and now we'll pull that bottom hose off. Okay, we're underneath the car again, and again kind of looking up at that radiator drain valve there, and then just to the left of it is one of the connections that leads back to the transmission, and you can see the clamp that's holding it on. Now on my Jeep, it's the radiator that's on there now, and the way it's hooked up, it's pretty easy to get that transmission fluid line off of there. You just squeeze that clamp and slide it back, and it pretty much comes right off. But there is a different type of fitting. I'm going to talk about that later on that you may have to deal with, but my particular Jeep has this kind of fitting. I will say that once I removed that clamp back, it was kind of hard to get the rubber hose off of there because that clamp had kind of embedded the rubber down in those little grooves there that's on the connector. And so I just got an X-Acto knife, a razor knife, and cut the rubber away, and there was plenty of slack, so I can just hook it back up after I cut away the part that I damaged moving it off of the connector there. So what we're going to do now is go back on top of the car, but I did want to show you these connectors here, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different type of connector that you might have on your Jeep. Okay, I've taken the 6 bolts off that hold the radiator to the frame of the car, and here are the 6 bolts. Alright, there. So now the radiator is loose. You can just like flop around here. See? So now what's going to happen is I'm going to just take it and just lift it straight up. That requires 2 hands, so I'm going to have to put the camera down here. I did climb underneath the car, and I kind of helped it past the fan guard where those connections to the transmission are. Makes it just a little bit easier to lift it straight out. So we'll do that next and be right back. Okay, so we got the radiator out of the Jeep. There it is right there. It's always good after you get a part out like that to compare it to the new one, make sure that all the flanges and screw holes and connections and everything kind of match up. It's much easier to find out there's something different when you got them both out here than to put the new one in and then try to figure out why everything's not lining up or why a bolt hole isn't there when it was on the old one. These did match up just fine. I will say that when I was removing the bottom bolt on both sides, it was a little bit more trickier than the top two, simply because there's just not a lot of room to work in there. But as long as you have the right kind of attachments for your ratchet, it shouldn't be too big of a problem. This is what I used right here. A deep socket and a shallow socket and then an extension there. I had to use all of those in different combinations at different times, but nothing major there. The bolts are 10 millimeter. That's the size there. Now, before we continue on, I just want to talk about these connections here at the bottom. As I said earlier, these are kind of tricky. And these are the connections here, one there and one there, that go to the transmission on your car, and transmission fluid flows through the tubing that connects to these two connections and is cooled. But there's two types of connectors for the Jeep Radiator. This one here is one that's just a standard. You just slide the tube on it and you clamp it down, and that's all there is to it. But they make a different kind of connector, and when I got the new Radiator here, it came with the new connector, and this is it right here. And this is one where there's a hard tubing that goes on there, and it requires a special tool to release that tubing from the connector. And if you don't know that, it can be very frustrating. Now, for my particular model here, it wasn't a factor because I had this type of a connector, which is also already installed on the new one, which was very standard. But if you wind up with a connector like this, you will need a special tool, either one that looks like that, there, or one that maybe looks like this, that will go around that connector and clamps down on there, and then you pull back on it and it just pops that right off with like a spring release. But if you don't have that, you will not get those connections off if you have that type of a connector. So just wanted to make sure you understand the difference between those. So with all that, what we're going to do now is we're going to put the old Radiator here into recycling, and we're going to install the new one into the Jeep. And installing the new one, it's just a reverse of everything that I showed you as far as what you connect up and when you connect it up. And when I come back, this one here will be in the Jeep, and I'll make a few more comments and we'll be done. Okay, so we've got the new Radiator in the Jeep. There it is right there, all nice and shiny. New Radiator cap. We replace the overflow container there by sliding it into those two slots, and when you slide it down, that little button just pops right into place and locks it in. And replace the tubing going just below the radiator cap there into the radiator for that. Put a new radiator hose, upper radiator hose on there. Well, I had this fan cover loose. I went ahead and pulled the cover for the thermostat. That's that housing right there with the two hoses going into it. And I replaced the thermostat. I recommend replacing the thermostat anytime you are replacing the radiator. It doesn't take that long to do, and it only costs about $12. So that's the top part is all done. Now what we'll do is we'll go underneath the car and we'll take a look at the connections there. Okay, we're underneath the car again. That's a familiar sight you've seen before. Looking up at the drain for the radiator. The new radiator comes with that drain closed. You may want to just make sure. You'll find out as soon as you start adding radiator fluid and antifreeze. There's one of the two connections going to the transmission. I had plenty of line when I just kind of cut the old one off at the connector. Again, mine has that type of a clamp right there that's very easy to take off. I told you about the ones that have a little bit more complicated connector. There is the other radiator hose, transmission hose going back to the transmission there, going into the radiator. And then that's the new lower radiator hose connection there with a new clamp as well. And that's it for underneath the car. Okay, so the only thing left to do is to replace the coolant. I use this concentrated coolant here and mix it with the water, half coolant. You can buy it pre-mixed as well. You may have lost some transmission fluid when you disconnected those lines to the old radiator. So I recommend checking your transmission fluid level, and if you need to add some transmission fluid, go ahead and do that. When you're adding the coolant, I recommend that you come over and squeeze this hose. This is with the engine running. You have to be careful, get your fingers down there in the fan, and just kind of work it back and forth a little bit like that, and that'll help work air out of the system, because there's a lot of air in there. There's a lot of air, of course, in the new radiator. A lot of air in all those hoses you just installed. So go ahead and kind of squeeze that hose like that, and that'll help work that air out. If you don't do that and you get an air bubble in the system, especially right in that hose there, it'll cause the thermostat not to operate properly. So that's the job. Radiator is in. Jeep 2000 Wrangler there. Going to take it out for a test spin here in just a few minutes. And hopefully this will help you as you replace your radiator. I'm sure I said something that was confusing or forgot to say something, so please just add anything that will help others in the comments on this video. Good luck.